Buenos días, señores oficiales, damas y caballeros presentes. Se da inicio a la conferencia Reaprender la guerra, lecciones del Mar Negro. Palabras del contraalmirante Kurt Botger-Garfias, director de la Escuela Superior de Guerra.
Buenos días a todos nuevamente. Como última actividad académica del año, teníamos pendiente esta conferencia, la cual tenemos el gran honor y privilegio de recibirla del Capitán de Navío y doctor André Pecher de la Academia de Liderazgo de la Bundeswehr alemana, que no solo es un excelente académico, investigador y oficial de Marina, sino también es un gran amigo del Perú y personalmente amigo mío. Ya que ha vivido ahora por 3 años, ¿cuántos años?
3 años. 3.
Entonces, como hemos venido diciendo durante todo este año académico, nuestra razón de ser es prepararnos para la guerra. Más allá de que se piense o no en la guerra existe y es una amenaza constante. Y el ejemplo es Europa, que se pensaba que era un continente de paz y ahora está sumido nuevamente en la amenaza de la guerra. No porque sea lejano, deja de afectarnos directamente a nosotros. Como saben, la Bundeswehr está en proceso de enfrentar esta situación de replanteamiento de lo que eran sus políticas de defensa y buscando, desde el punto de vista de la academia, pensar cómo es la mejor manera de asumir el nuevo carácter que asume la guerra. Sin más, y estamos muy interesados en escuchar la importante conferencia que puede darnos de primera mano, porque sé que han estado trabajando incluso exponiendo al Parlamento, al Bundestag sobre esa problemática. Y qué privilegio poder nosotros recibir esta misma conferencia. Muchas gracias.
Señor almirante, querido Kurt, damas y caballeros, siempre es un placer de conectarme con los peruanos porque siempre es un placer de intercambiar. Como el almirante Böttger he dicho, yo fui agregado de defensa en el Perú de los alemanes, yo con mi familia, y el tiempo fue muy agradable para nosotros y muy interesante y aprendimos mucho sobre su país excepcional y muy bonito. Eso es un placer de charlar y un privilegio, pero lamentablemente en cuestiones técnicas mi español es un poco, digamos, oxidado, entonces quisiera de cambiar en inglés si está bien para ustedes, ¿ok? Next slide, please.
Captain Pecher, excuse me, I will introduce you.
El próximo dispositivo, por favor. Next slide. Yes, I hear you. Please, next slide, please.
Can I make the presentation, please? Introduction? Oh.
Your next slide, please. Go ahead to the next slide. I will give you the order next slide, and then it's for you the sign to swap over to the next one. Just give to the next slide, okay? Thank you. So next slide, please. Excellent. Okay, so what are we talking today? Today we're talking, as mentioned, about the war at sea, in the Black Sea. And I would like to address some lessons learned and lessons identified and conclusions from that sea, what we see and observe within the last almost 4 years in the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. Why is it of importance for us in Germany? As mentioned, within 18 years the war came back to Europe, and we are faced with great threats from Russia in various points. It is disinformation campaigns, sabotage, it's the political large-scale operations in terms of assassinations and some diplomatic tricks, what we see. And we are faced with also economic aspects as well as lethal injects, and it refers to our fundamental core values with regards to peace and stability. Okay, next slide, please. So, what's the structure of my short presentation for today within the next 30 plus minutes? Well, first of all, I would like to give a short preface just to test your Russian skills. Afterwards, I would touch a little bit on observation and phenomena, what we have seen, and then I would like hand over to a point which is I would like to introduce to you 3 theses, what you could conclude to my point of view from the war at sea in the Black Sea. And finally, I would like to come to conclusion before we get into a question and answer period. I would love to get into discussions with you. Next slide, please. Here you can see a quote from Admiral Alexander Moseyev, the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Navy, being quoted at the 19th June of 2024 at the International Maritime Saloon in Kronstadt. I guess you might be a little bit confused, so we will get into the next slide, please. Okay. So, quote, at this trade fair, we are seeing particularly a large number of presentation of unmanned technologies. I cannot refrain from mentioning the topic of unmanned systems and robotic complexities. This is not only relevant, it's the objective or the real objective for our time. As the president, meant here with President Putin, of our country, said at the forum in St. Petersburg, this is a disruptive, literally an explosive technology. It's explosive introduction in all areas of activity, including the defense industry, it's necessary. Undoubtedly, they will be used primarily in the Navy, since a ship used by the Navy is a complex system and the activities of a modern fleet are impossible without the use of these technology. Next slide. So, what does it mean if a Russian top admiral is talking about this phenomenon? So, since the Russian large-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian Black Sea has suffered significant losses. According to various Western and Ukrainian sources, after more than almost 4 years of combat, between a quarter and a third the Black Sea is disabled or destroyed. And in 2024, the British Defense Secretary concluded that the Black Sea Fleet was functionally inactive. It was a combination of mass, speed, and explosive munitions caused this damage through gradual wear and tear. Numerous Russian warships, landing craft, and combat support vessels were damaged or even sunk, and Russia was forced to significantly reinforce its defenses and physical barriers in the entrance of her Sevastopol naval base. As a result of this long campaign, the Ukrainians were able to severely restrict the freedom of movement of Russian warships in the Black Sea, and Ukrainian attacks on ships and infrastructures forced Russian ships to relocate at the bases on the eastern Black Sea coast. Given the significance of the Black Sea War as a relatively rare example of high-intensity naval warfare, the enormous problems faced by the reinforced Black Russian fleet and maintaining maritime control. The maritime dimension of the Russia-Ukrainian war has been the subject of intense academic debate for several years. It is therefore not surprising that the changing of the nature of the coastal and operational environment and the ever-increasing challenges faced by conventional navies operating in confined waters with numerous manned and unmanned weapons systems have attracted attention and generated debate far beyond the Black Sea War. So, a few thoughts, discourses, and theses I would like to address on the war in the Black Sea based on our work in the GIDS, the think tank of the German Armed Forces. Next slide, please. In doing so, I would like to address some observations on the war and some leading questions. One is drones dominate all dimensions of war, land, sea, and air, and in a level of the technical, the operational, and the strategic level. Second, in combat, the electromagnetic spectrum has assumed a new prominent position in naval warfare, or even in the other warfare areas as well, in land and air. Third, a profoundly inferior navy is fighting very successfully against indicated that Ukraine had begun equipping USVs with heat-seeking anti-air missiles to threaten Russian air resources to an anti-USV patrol. On December 31 in 2024, Ukrainian government agencies released video footage allegedly showing the Guerra 5 unmanned aerial vehicle destroying a Russian Mi-8 helicopter, which also is in Europe, as I remember in your settings and your Navy. And they were damaging a second with an R-73 missile near the Crimea. The R-73 was originally an air-to-air missile and was adapted for the surface-launched naval version, the Sea Dragon. In contrast, this was reported in December 2023 that the Russians tested small unmanned aerial systems flown from patrol boats in an anti-UAV role. Future developments include various possibilities, such as underwater vehicles acting as drone motherships. Similarly, naval drones could increasingly be capable of firing weapons that can severely damage fixed-wing aircraft, ships, and inland targets. Next slide, please. To return to the Anglo-Saxon Naval Agreement, autonomous systems are currently subject to certain limitations, for example, regarding range or environment, as Duncan Redford, my good friend and fellow and historian at the British Ministry of Defense, has pointed out. However, given the wide range of constantly evolving drone designs and their potential applications, it would be a mistake to consider only potential threats and opportunities within a specific capability category at any given time. So there are some limits to the evolving system with regards to the progress of solution for problems that are still evolving from the past to the present. Next slide, please. Now I would like to come to a second thesis, which is regarded into the naval theory of the French in the 19th century, the so-called Jeune École. And I'm quite sure that this is also subject to your explanations in classes as well at the essay. In comparison of drone to the submarine also raises further discussions about the strategic school of thought closely associated with the use of submarines by the Jeune École. The character, by the way, of this Jeune École was, or the French Navy in the 19th century, that they're inferior to the British Navy. They had no battleship and big capital ship and to bring into the table for a potential fight to the British. So they were seeking for solutions with minor platforms such as submarines and torpedo boats. Next slide, please. Before we delve into the conflict, we should recall that Jeune École has received little praise in strategic literature to date. After a brief tenure of Admiral Aoube as Minister of the Navy, the French Navy, one of the leading figures of the Jeune École, the course of a naval strategy in France was reversed by Ian Speller, summarized like this: even in France, there was never a consensus in favor of their Jeune École's author's note policies, and French naval policy remained divided. Ultimately, the Jeune École failed in their attempt to bring radical change to the French naval policy. Much like its French predecessor, the Soviet successor, the Molodaya Scola, was also quickly replaced by the vision of the Stalinian grain fleet, which seemed more appropriate to the Soviet Union's superpower status. What significance can the Jeune École possibly have if, as Professor Andrew Lambert, a leading British naval historian, points out, there is never a historical example of this school of strategic thought ever having worked in practice? Well, we come to this point later. Admiral Gorshkov, Commander-in-Chief, or former Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Union Navy, must also be counted among these critics. According to Gorshkov, it was an equally grave mistake that this battle was fought almost exclusively by submarines, which received no support from other branches of the naval forces, especially from the Air Force. To quote, the priority development of this only one warfare branch of the subsurface forces ultimately had to lead to a drastic limitation of the Germans' fleet spectrum to task when fighting against the enemy's fleet. So, central thoughts or must-haves to Gorshkov's vision was the development of a balanced fleet. We all believed up until today in the war in the Black Sea. In building up our naval forces, he mentioned, care is and always will be taken to ensure that all elements that constitute their combat power are always in the most favorable combination that they have, as we say today, a balanced structure or a well-propered fleet design. Next slide, please. Armed with these considerations regarding the journey call, we now take a little look at what the Ukrainian did, what Ukraine did and did not in the Black Sea. After Ukraine successfully established an A2AD zone in the East Slavic parlance and missile artillery position in the northwestern Black Sea in the first half of 2022, the reinforced Russian Black Sea fleet was forced to withdraw from the northwestern Black Sea. The Ukrainian launched a large-scale naval blockade across the entire Black Sea region. In the following years, numerous Russian warships were attacked and some severely damaged by Ukrainian-based US-based vessels. Examples include, for instance, alleged destructions of the corvettes Ivanovets in January-February 2024, or for instance, the Sergei Kotov, attacked in September 2023, allegedly sunk in March 2024, as well as the tank-leading ship Cesar Kulikov in February 2024. And not being mentioned so far, the huge cruiser Moscow in April 2022. The Russian Black Sea forces responded in various ways, including the use of electromagnetic warfare and strengthening of their naval capabilities. However, even as the Russian naval forces attempted to adapt, losses mounted. As early in August 2022, British intelligence noted that Russian patrols were generally limited to waters within the sides of the Crimean coast. As subsequent years have shown, even this restriction to waters near Crimea could not prevent Russians' losses from continuing to accumulate. Ukrainian drone tactics involved attacks by swarms of numerous, fast, and continuously upgraded and specialized unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. Speed and numbers, and the words of the Arne Russell, the mentor of the Ukrainian Navy, of Johnny Cole, his vision of the Ukrainian Navy, was central to the Ukrainian naval warfare approach. Furthermore, various videos released by the Ukrainian security agency show attacks in poor visibility, particularly at night, when the drones could fully exploit their small signatures. This immediately brings to mind nighttime torpedo boats attack no larger, significantly more heavy-armed warship. One of the Johnny Cole's guiding principles. As a French officer wrote under a pseudonym in 1885, de nuit, l'avantage de port de torpillier, meaning when the night falls, the torpedo boats have the advantage. Essentially, the means of methods of Ukraine employed to undermine the strength of the Russian Black Sea fleet closely reminds the Junikov's mindset. Next slide, please. Now we come to the third thesis. Revolution or evolution and revolution. I mentioned at the beginning that the innovations in naval warfare have provoked reactions from commentators worldwide. Here are two examples. Next slide, please. Admiral Stavridis writes about an Agincourt moment in the Battle of 1415. Does anyone know what happened about the Battle of Agincourt? Well, it was a new invention that has provided with the longbows on the Anglo-Saxon side, or the English in war against the French, a revolution of military affairs. At least at last year's British Naval Powers Conference, the first Sea Lord, considering the changing environment in which navies must operate, speaks of a dreadnought moment. That was the moment in which the British designed a new type of ship. They were technically inferior to the former battleships and cruisers, and which brought to an advantaged position to the British, the Royal Navy at the end of the 19th century. So overall, Wall Street Journal speaks of a revolution in modern warfare about the war in Ukraine, especially the war at sea. Next slide, please. What exactly is a revolution in military affairs, in the military sense? Well, shortly, the term RMA. A revolution in military affairs occurred at first glance in the 70s by Russian thinkers, but it came up to a prominence, a term in the 1990s in the Gulf War. It has been particularly associated with the Gulf War in 1990-91. And if we look at the balance of power between the Iraqi army and the coalition of forces, especially the US Army, we see roughly the comparable numbers. Both sides with approximately 1 million soldiers, with a slight advantage in armored forces for the US. However, the differences in casualties are staggering. Approximately 47 coalition soldiers killed by the enemy action versus 20 to 50,000 Iraqi kills and more than 75,000 wounded. This is argued was due to an RMA, that is extreme technological and doctrinal changes that the US Armed Forces mastered, but the Iraqis did not. Keywords being network-centric warfare, satellite-based weapons system, and so on. According to this definition, an RMA is a paradigm shift in the nature and the conduct of military operations, which renders obsolete or irrelevant one or more core competencies. Next slide, please. Well, honestly speaking, many experts would disagree with this thesis. At a more abstract level, some academics go even further, questioning whether recent events allow us to infer that technology is yet again changing the character of naval warfare. Instead, they argue for an operational approach to interpreting the use of naval drones, or to refer to the arms race between asymmetric threats on the one side and conventional threats as a countermeasure, not as a revolutionary, but rather than recurring a theme in modern naval history. For instance, the destroyers. Next slide, please. So, what are my thoughts on this? The challenge posed by drone technology is so significant because it's capitalized on a dilemma specific to the phase of warship productions in the 21st century. Modern warships have become so highly advanced and complex in their multi-dimensional warfare capabilities that they have become incredibly expensive. As a logical consequence, the force size of most navies have shrunk considerably, even in Germany. We used to have numbers of 300 up until 1990, now we have something like 50. Indeed, as a logical consequence for the forces sizes and most navies have shrunk considerably. In contrast with drones, we are seeking systems that have devastating effects and can be mass-produced at relatively low cost, both in terms of material and personnel. Indeed, this cost efficiency in naval warfare has reached a whole new level. The sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse Second World War serves a prime example. The Prince of Wales, a battleship and one of the most modern and advanced ships of this time, at that time, was sunk by Japanese naval aircraft in late 41, along with a British battle cruiser, although the Japanese suffered losses. 3 Japanese aircraft were shut down, 28 damaged during the battle. The loss of the few aircraft was negligible compared to the destruction of the 44,000-ton battleship and another battle cruiser. As Jacqueline Schneider and Julia MacDonald argue in their 2024 article, Looking Back to Look Forward, Autonomous Systems, Military Revolutions and the Importance of Cost, this cost calculations is the actual RMA, the real-time military analyst at stake. I think there's something to this argument. The use of these technology changes cost calculations so drastically if one wants to work with RMA models. The present situation presents a stark reality. According to available footage, in the Russian-Ukrainian war, Russians' UAVs and UAS launched from the helicopters were used against Ukrainians. UAS and at ground war. UAS were also used against USVs. In fact, that robots are fighting robots doesn't qualify as an RMA. Then the question arises whether the theoretical concept should be applied. Academics and practitioners must consider that the Russian Navy will adapt to this changing nature of the conflict at sea, just as Russian ground troops in the Donbass are adapting to the new realities on land. The speech of by Admiral Mosayev, quoted in the introduction of this presentation, the plans of the military-industrial holding companies came set to arm the Russian Vizier unmanned submarine, and the statement of Nicholas Patrushev, former secretary of the Russian Security Council and advisor to the Russian president, that, quote, the Russian Navy is already being equipped with unmanned boats, unquote, and, quote, the production has been significantly increased due to the experience gained from the special military operation, unquote. All point in this direction. In this case, NATO would face a serious asymmetric threats, and as a consequence, we must rethink fleet design and the way how we deploy forces. Next slide. During the World War II, battleships, for example, focused less on naval combat and the role for which they were primarily designed, and more on support function as anti-aircraft platform to protect aircraft carriers from the enemy air attacks. This role was particularly important when Allied fleets faced the kamikazes threats in the final stage of the war. Countering the enemy's sacrificial tactics required substantial armament and stopping power. Similarly, defending against unmanned surface systems used for suicide attacks requires significant stopping power, especially against surface-to-surface, closed-in weapon systems. Given that, under the current condition, it is not capital ship, but smaller, lighter-armed surface combatants that are most vulnerable to drone attacks. We may need to reconsider their role. As illustrated by the example of Duncan Redford's earlier, some analysts have emphasized the continued importance of conventional naval operations. These arguments draw particular attention to the developments on the high seas, where drones may operate with greater difficulty, tough, not impossible, especially when launched from a mothership. This argument certainly seems to be valid. However, there's no need to push the argument to its extreme. It doesn't have to be an either-or situation. Has an airplane replaced by the warship as an instrument of naval warfare? No, it hasn't. But it has fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. Since the First World War, naval warfare without naval aviation has been conceivable. Likewise, we can conclude that every fleet must henceforth consider unmanned systems as an integral part of the fleet design. Next slide, please. Coming close to the end of my discourse and my presentation, I will just say, well, in a medium-sized navy, such as, for instance, the German Navy, right now we have two schools, or we have two, let's say, powers we need to balance being faced with the lessons learned and the deductions of war and the plan. One is a trend for the high seas, that the fleet should be more, and the trend more conventional and manned warship. However, in contrast, if it refers to the littorals, the trend is towards more an unmanned asymmetric system. You could say the David and Goliath principle, which refers more to the region of the littorals. Overall, it is key for us, for the Peruvian Navy or for the German Navy, as a medium-sized Navy, to balance the fleet or the fleet design in terms of forces or resources. So this is one of the outcomes of the current observations in war at the naval war of the Black Sea. Next slide, please. Now, with a recall of my thesis, I would like to conclude my presentation with my thesis number one. There are no finite solutions for problems that are still evolving. Well, evolution of the past may provide us with ideas of evolution in the future, but there is a but. But there are limits, as Duncan Redford has mentioned out, or as I have mentioned out, if it refers to geographic aspects or other evolutions and limitations, such as money, material, or technology capabilities. Thesis number two. Under certain conditions, the theory of the genical can function. So this is in contrast to Andrew Lambert's thesis that genical has never ever proven its pragmatism or its verification in history. Well, we can assume to a certain extent it has proven, and the Ukrainians have demonstrated very well and very bravely what this genical approach can do. But there's also a but. You could say it is a yes, but it needs innovation, creativity, technology, unconventional ways of thinking, and its functions currently only in the littoral or coastal area. Coming up to thesis number three, evolution or revolution. To my point of view, it is indeed what was happening in the Ukraine, at the Black Sea. It is an RMA, but it is defined from the point of view of the goal or the desired effects, the strategic dimension. So the cost-effect benefit ratio is a key to understand. But some other aspects you could also, you could lead to another matrix, which is more military-minded, to state out whether if you have the proof if it's an RMA or simply an evolution. But I would say, let's say we eyewitness an RMA. But overall, And then, I would like to conclude, to win a war while conducting a large-scale invasion, you need boots on the ground. So everything is not practical or applicable in naval war if you cannot provide boots on the ground. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to hear your questions. Thank you.
Agradecemos a nuestro expositor. A continuación se procederá con una ronda de preguntas de la audiencia.
Thank you very much for this question, and it is a vital question for us. Well, to a certain extent, you could argue the Baltic Sea is more or less quite similar. It is a little slightly smaller, but the nature is more or less the same. Well, we expect a vice versa aspect that whereas the Ukraine Navy in the Black Sea is playing a role from the Bible, the David, and the Russian Navy is playing the role of the Goliath. NATO in the Baltic Sea, in contrary, is superior in terms of conventional platforms and capabilities. So we expect a situation where Russia is inferior in the Black Sea by military means, whereas NATO is superior. But this brings Russia to a situation where they slip into the world of David, and they will threaten us with, let's say, more or less asymmetric threats, and partly with a genical approach as well, by using UAVs, by using sabotage aspects to threaten our bigger ships in the Baltics. So this is where we think of a different image of war, and we are faced with it. So for instance, that you have effects from land by missiles towards the sea. So it's the other way around, what we have learned from the US in the 90s, from the sea towards land as a doctrine from the US, a maritime doctrine. And you see quite a lot of espionage from the Russian fleet, but not only from military or naval vessels, but even from civilian vessels, so-called the Russian shadow fleet. So we currently reframe our doctrines for the Baltic Sea, and with regards to the threats we observe, we prepare for the next war, and we have heavily changed some aspect that our fleet design will be, let's say, enriched by a variety type of drones.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Well, this is one of the key questions, Kurt. I would say it's always what we see right now. It's always let's say a chicken run in between innovation and adaptation. To be honest, there is a period of adoption when the Ukraine brings a new innovation in terms of drone. It takes about 2 months to have a countermeasure, to develop a countermeasure, or to adopt the threat to develop a countermeasure, and vice versa goes on. So we have an ongoing process that comes every 2 or 3 months with a new peaks in terms of developments of the drones. Well, I would say there still is some sense that you have two images of war. One is you have an RNA, or you have this hybrid war, asymmetric threats in the coastal areas on the littorals, such as, for instance, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, in parts the Mediterranean, for instance, where you have a very choppy coastal line, and where it's not so deep. The water space is not so deep, but there is, to my point of view, within the next 20 to, let's say, roughly 30 years, the maneuverous approach at the high sea will still exist at the same time. So I think medium-sized navies should be aware are challenged to be ready for two threats. One is the maneuverous approach, the classical conventional way of war, and the other way is the asymmetric threat where you are being faced by drones. The issue is, in Germany, a submarine costs about 1 billion euros today, and a frigate as well, a little bit more than 1 billion. But if you develop, for instance, 2 or 3 drones like the Magura 5 drones, you bring these drones quite close to this frigate, and the costs are something around 300,000 euro. You could argue, well, you have a cost price efficiency issue with that, and even psychological. So I think we have two kinds of wars. One will be at the high seas with a conventional war within the next, let's say, 2 or 3 decades, whereas you have to be prepared. And we have a new ongoing technology and evolution is going on with the hybrid and asymmetric threat with the drones, for instance.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Si no hay más preguntas, agradecemos a nuestro expositor por la valiosa información y conocimiento brindado.
Reitero el agradecimiento, André, por tu tiempo. Sabemos que es de noche y estás fuera de horas de trabajo, aún en la oficina, solo con nosotros. Y te agradecemos y sin duda la información que has compartido con nosotros será muy valiosa para los oficiales en su proceso de desarrollo profesional. Nuevamente pido un aplauso para...
Señor Almirante, querido Kurt, muchísimas gracias por este buque de flores y ojalá pueda cumplir las expectaciones en ese sentido. Eso fue, como se dice, un enrichment por la clase y currículum para ustedes, y para mí fue un honor y un placer de dar un inyecto en este sentido con esta presentación como resultados de nuestras investigaciones en los últimos 2 años. Muchísimas gracias.
Siempre bienvenido desde tu casa.
Igual manera. Saludos por casa.
Agradecidos, señores oficiales, se da por terminada la conferencia. Todos de pie.